Father Milton, Your Honours, distinguished guests, fellow members, dear scholars. Welcome to the Greek Archaeological Committee's 55th lecture. It is with great pleasure that I present our speaker this evening, who is none other but Bettany Hughes. Despite the myriad tasks that go with showing on the nation's screens her brilliant work in publishing her bestsellers, Bettany has magnanimously managed to devote this evening to us, and we are deeply grateful to her. As a historian, Bettany Hughes has been inspired by Greece's past and has made a number of documentaries and written books about it, but I shall say more about her work in a couple of minutes. Because Bettany is well aware of our mission and supports our work, I believe she will not object to a very brief intermission to let me say a few words about the Greek Archaeological Committee UK and make an appeal particularly among you who have joined us here for the first time. The Greek Archaeological Committee UK is a British registered charity which was founded in 1986 by Mrs. Matty Egan. We are the only such institution outside Greece which promotes Greek archaeology to as wide an audience as our means permit, by presenting twice a year in London the latest excavations conducted in Greece and Cyprus by eminent archaeologists or by renowned historians. But most importantly, and thanks to generous donations by our founder, Matty Egan, the A.G. Leventis Foundation, the Samurkas Foundation of New York, as well as our member subscriptions, we grant to young Greek and Greek Cypriot holders of first-class degrees of limited means scholarships for postgraduate studies in Greek archaeology in the UK. Many of our past scholars now hold academic posts in the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, Greece, the US, or work in Greece in the Archaeological Service. This year we have 10 continuing and 3 new scholars whose subjects span from the Paleolithic to the Byzantine periods. Ladies and gentlemen, our scholars.
And I'm doing a DPhil in Oxford in archaeology.
Good evening, my name is Kyriakos. I study late antique archaeology in the University of Birmingham.
Hello, my name is Rafael Laudaris and I'm having an MPhil in archaeology in the University of Cambridge.
Hello, my name is Daphne Vladi. I'm doing a DPhil in classical archaeology at the University of Oxford.
Hello, my name is Manuel Spagalos, and I'm doing a PhD in archaeology in the University of Leicester, Hellenistic period.
Hello, my name is Paschalis Manogiannelis. I'm a PhD student in Durham University, late antiquity.
Hello, my name is Katerina Vilenza, and I'm doing a PhD in maritime archaeology in the University of Southampton.
Good evening, I'm Rodos Momakolau, and I am doing my PhD at King's College, Byzantine Archaeology.
Please. Hello, I'm Yannis Apostoulou, and I'm doing an MSc in Classical Archaeology at the University of Oxford.
Postgraduate students from Greece and Cyprus needed assistance, it is now. By becoming a member of our well-established British charitable institution or making a donation, you will be contributing to the dissemination of fresh archaeological thought as well as to the forging of closer links between British and Greek academia. In these difficult times, when classical studies, the core of our civilization, are under attack and shrinking worldwide, we are proud to be able to help keep research student numbers up in leading British universities. Remember that every penny of subscriptions or donations goes into the scholarship fund and are paid as fees to British universities, while our founder, Matty Egan, generously underwrites the expenses of the 2 annual lectures. And now back to our speaker. Professor Bettany Hughes needs, of course, no further introduction. Anyone, anywhere with an interest in history or archaeology would know her past work well and her brilliant latest. It's a great privilege that she's here this evening. I could stop here, but I shall stick to tradition and say a few more words about her. Historian, broadcaster, prolific author of history bestsellers, keen observer, charismatic presenter. She has been appearing on our TV screens and our bookshelves for 25 years. Her heavy academic commitments with specialism in ancient and medieval history and culture include teaching at Oxford, Cambridge, UCL, Bristol, Manchester, Cornwall, Maastricht and Utrecht. She is a research fellow at King's College London and visiting professor of history at the New College of the Humanities. For all this output, Bettany Hughes was awarded the Distinguished Friend of Oxford Award as honorary doctorate by York University, Fellowship of Cardiff University and the Norton Medlicott Award for History. Her books Helen of Troy and The Hemlock Cup are already bestsellers, and her latest, Istanbul, is already on the way to becoming one. Somehow, in her spare time, she has written and presented more than 50 TV and radio documentaries. Who watched and listened? More than 250 million people worldwide did. For all this, she was awarded the Naomi Sargent Education Prize for Broadcast Excellence and a special award for services to Hellenic culture and heritage. She is active on the issue of women's position in society, launched the UK's Inspiring Women Mentoring Scheme, is a member of the Women of the World Committee, and she was named one of BBC's 100 Global Women. Of particular interest to some of us here this evening is her role as honorary founding patron of Classics for All, a national campaign to reintroduce classical languages and civilization to state schools. Bettany Hughes is co-founder of Sandstone Global, which is dedicated to producing the best work by the best people for the best reasons. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the very best, Bettany Hughes.
Gosh, so kind. How do I follow that introduction? Thank you so much, Zetta. That's very, very generous of you. I do sound very busy. I drink a lot of coffee, ladies and gentlemen. I think that's how I manage it. Just before I start, a couple of very quick thank yous. Thank you to the Hellenic Centre, as ever, for hosting this evening with such grace and elan. It's my third time here in 3 months, so it's becoming a home from home. Thank you to the Greek Archaeological Committee UK and for the extraordinary work it does. I think you can see from the scholars and students who came up here just how centrally important it is to the worlds that we all love. And I think particularly now when we have watched exquisite archaeology being destroyed in front of our eyes, we realise that we need to preserve it with all our wit and will and wisdom. So thank you. Yeah, I'm going on and off on my phone. Should we put the main one back on? Lovely sound person. Yes. Where is the technical lovely man? Why don't you... Just so that I don't. I'm not very technical, even though I do lots of technical. Thank you. Fantastic. So thank you to Matty Egan, as ever, for her generous support and love for what we do and for what others do. And I'd like to dedicate this evening in honour and memory of Nicholas Egan, who was a great friend of mine, a great friend of many, I think, in this room, and who, I have to say, the first person, when I'd written the book, the first person I asked whether he thought it was worth anything or not was Nicholas. And I was very anxious about the reply, because he is such an extraordinary, well-read man, and he said it was okay. So I think I got away with it. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to the scholars and students and co-adventurers in the room for your inspiration. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming here on this very chilly February evening. I will attempt to bring a bit of Eastern Mediterranean sunshine into the room tonight, because my subject is indeed Constantinople, the queen of cities, the world's desire, the greatest city on earth. And what I would love to do with you in just the hour or so that we have together is to explore whether it's a city that deserves those extraordinary, quite hyperbolic epithets. And I will stick my neck out right away and say, I think it does, and I tell you why. Not just because of extraordinary, rich cultural splendours that there are in Istanbul, not just because of the fact that it is a city that through history has raced up the political agenda. I found when I was writing this book, it took me 10 years to research and write. And my goodness, I had to rewrite the conclusion and the introduction many times because history was being made so regularly in the city. Not just for all of those reasons, but because it seems to me it's a city that has supported such a diverse range of human experience. It teaches us something very important. It teaches us what it takes to make a city, and also what it takes to live together as a species. And I think, particularly now, we're realising this is a very complex thing. It's difficult sometimes living with a family, it's difficult living in a village, in a town, but in a city, how do we work it out so that we can all cohabit? And I think that Istanbul offers us some suggestions and solutions from history. So that's what I'm going to be looking at. When I was researching this book, I found that actually it has a history that stretches back 800,000 years, so pre-Homo sapiens. And as I said, it took me a decade to write, so you will forgive me if I rattle through somewhat. But what I'm going to focus on is the archaeology of the city in honour of the Greek Archaeological Committee UK tonight. So that's what I'm going to do. Before I start though, I just wanted to share a very brief story with you. As some of you in this room will know, I have two lovely daughters who I have dragged around to every site in the Eastern Mediterranean with me since they were both born, and I have to say they are great Hellenophiles as a result. But occasionally, when I announce that we're going to go on a walking historical tour of a city, I see their shoulders go down rather than up. And this was the case when I was in Istanbul a couple of years ago. So I could tell that I was just about at the edge of tolerance. So I said, okay, girls, well, rather than the walking historical tour, we're going to go on a boat on the trail of this remarkable historical character, Theodora, Empress Theodora. Many of you will know, in the 6th century AD. Those of you who don't, she is quite a remarkable person. Theodora, I'm going to be talking about her a bit later. She had, as was put very beautifully by the patriarch of the Greek Church, a troubled childhood, Theodora, but through thick and thin made it to become the Empress, the Augusta of the great Byzantine Empire, and ruled over 1 million square miles. And one of the things about Theodora is that she was very keen on baths, on taking a bath. So what I wanted to do was to cross the Sea of Marmara on the trail of Theodora to visit one of the baths that she used to go in what was then Prusa, is now the city of Bursa in Anatolia. So I said to the girls, great, we're going to get on a boat and go across the Sea of Marmara, which we did, to follow in the trail of Theodora. Her baths still exist in Bursa. I don't know if any of you have been, the 6th century structure is still there. And the amazing thing about Theodora, when she once went to go for a bath, because she wanted the world to know that she had made quite a journey of social mobility, she travelled with no fewer than 4,000 courtiers. So it was quite an expedition. She went very regularly. We now think, actually, that she died young, aged 48, almost certainly of breast cancer. And there's been some brilliant work that has discovered that she actually had a mastectomy. It's the first recorded mastectomy in medieval history. But we think she was probably going to the baths actually to try to relieve the symptoms of the pain of cancer. But anyway, so for many reasons, I was really determined to get to Theodora's baths. So travelled to Bursa, got to the baths, went in. So stupid, I don't know why I hadn't kind of thought about this, because they are functioning baths. Of course, Theodora's baths in Bursa, and now men-only baths. But I thought, I can't be foiled, you know, I've got this bath. So I found a screen in the bath, and in a sort of Dad's Army manoeuvre, hid behind the screen and edged my way towards the door of the bath so I could peer in. And then again, so stupid, what was I thinking? Because it's a bath, a hot steam bath, all the men inside were naked. So I looked like this kind of hideous, ghastly, kind of middle-aged, peeping Thomasina, peering at my two girls, pink with embarrassment behind me. Anyway, but I had done it. I had, you know, briefly witnessed the baths of Theodora. So we sort of made rather hasty exits. We travelled back across on the ferry, the Seaman, back to Istanbul. And as we travelled back, I'm sure some of you will have been on those boats, and they all had television sets in them. And we'd left a city in peace, and 3 days later, on our way back, we saw from the television screens that Istanbul was a city on fire. And these were the Gezi Park protests, the Taksim Square riots of 2013. And suddenly, there were riot police, there were cars turned upside down, and where we were staying, Taksim Square was aflame. But I thought, well, this is sort of slightly awkward, because I've got these two young girls with me, but this is history in the making. So I said to them, actually, is it all right? I think we ought to go to this riot, just to sort of see what's happening. So dragged them in. It looked like it had died down, so I wasn't being completely irresponsible. And then as we arrived, basically the riot police and the tear gas were sent in. And one of my daughters, who has asthma, I suddenly went from being one of the coolest mothers to one of the most irresponsible, started to go about the same colour as the blue of this book. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you that tear gas and asthma don't make a great mix. But as we were beating a hasty exit, I suddenly saw a bit of historical graffiti on one of the windows. Which, if you are a Turkish reader, you know to read up here. And I said, can you still breathe? Because I've got to, there's a bit of historical graffiti on the window, I've just got to take a photo. Which is anyway, but I took it, and she is still alive, so it was worth the risk. But I don't know if you can see, it just seemed to me incredible that in the heat of that moment, when people were fearing for their lives, somebody had wanted to make a historical statement, and what they'd written on this window was Istanbul, Byzantium, Constantinople, Byzin is ours. And what that word Byzin means is not an isolationist statement. It means it is something that belongs to all of us through time. That this is a city that is connected by place across time. And just at that moment, I realised this is a city that has such an extraordinarily tenacious character. It's a city that is protean and poetic, but that has such a sense of itself. Whatever civilization is in charge, the city itself belongs to those around it. So that really focused my mind when I was writing the book, and I wanted therefore to make it a book not about the city, but about the citizens that have inhabited it through time. There are really interesting tropes that carry on in the story of Constantinople. One of them being identified by that riot. So that protest, that riot, was about all kinds of things. It was about freedom of speech, it was about democracy, it was about social justice. It was sparked by the fact that some trees in Gezi Park were threatened by the developers. And Constantinople is a city that has always loved its green spaces. It's always loved the kind of bucolic nature within it. And you see that right from the very beginning of the city, from its prehistoric origins through to the Byzantine period, when the great processional way of Constantinople was flagged by vegetable gardens, because it was a walled city, so it had to feed itself. So I always kind of love this notion of the emperors and the empresses processing down the Mese, the middle route, surrounded by kind of onions and garlic growing, and later aubergines, this sort of glorified processional allotment that they would have walked through. And visitors talked a lot about the beauty of the city, the lavender bushes there, the rosemary that grew, the constant hum of bees visiting the flowers and the plants in the city. So it's a place which holds a memory of certain things, and a memory, for instance, of its bucolic nature is something that matters. But what those protests were really about was the fact, as I said, that it's a city where citizens are allowed to have a voice. It's almost as though it's such an extraordinary place, topographically. It can't be ruled by rulers. The city itself is such a character that its citizens are the people who really are in charge of the place, spiritually and politically. So in order to understand the city, what I've done is follow the story of the men and women who walked its streets through time. And I start at the beginning, ladies and gentlemen, with prehistory. So what you're looking at here is evidence of one of the very, very earliest inhabitants of what is now Constantinople, Istanbul. Rather unkindly, when I showed this image in Oxford a couple of weeks ago, somebody asked me whether it was an image of an avocado holder. It's something much more exciting than that. What you're looking at here is an 8,000-year-old footprint. And there are about 2,000 or so of these footprints that have been identified so far in the pre-Bosphorus march. And they were discovered because of the vast amount of development there is in the city. So because a tunnel has been built, you know, both a road and a rail tunnel underneath the Bosphorus connecting Asia and Europe, and because of the development of the metro system, vast amounts of archaeology have appeared. So far there are 90,000 crates of archaeological finds, many of which are still being worked on. Very few of those have been published. So it is an extraordinary time to be looking at the history of the city through its archaeology. And as I said, some of the finds include these amazing footprints. This, we think, belonged to a man wearing a leather shoe. There are also footprints of women and children with bare feet. And incredible things have survived from that very, very earliest iteration of the city. We have spoons made out of wild cow bone, the world's oldest canoe paddle, the world's oldest wooden coffin with a youngish woman of about 36 or so curled up in a fetal position inside. So you really get a sense of this small, plucky community making a life for itself on the banks of the sea with this very beautiful, fecund environment. 9,000 species of flora have been discovered. Vast numbers of animal bones. It's obviously a very rich and beautiful place to live. So a place that had real promise right back in prehistory 8,000 years ago. But then there was a problem. Around 5,400 BCE, there was a massive geoseismic event, and the sea levels started to rise. And we know that the sea levels rose at an incredible rate, so around 268 feet in 300 days. So just imagine the rate of that level of rise. 10 cubic miles of water came pouring over the landsill, about 600 square miles of land were flooded. And what that created was the Bosphorus Channel. And I've just put up here an image of the Bosphorus. You can obviously see the Sea of Marmara, Black Sea above, and the prehistoric settlements in and around what was, as I said, the kind of prototype of Istanbul. So this was a geoseismic event that destroyed worlds, and there's very interesting work being done now on the flooded communities that are underneath the Black Sea. But it also made the possibility of Constantinople, Istanbul, as a world-class city, because suddenly this was a city that, as we famously described, connects east and west, but more importantly, now connected north and south. So this was a city, thanks to the Bosphorus Straits, that could allow a swift and fast access from the Black Sea right the way through the Sea of Marmara and down to Africa. Just a little tiny bit of information about the Bosphorus, just so you know, many of you I know will have travelled on it, and you will know that sailors and boatsmen hate travelling on the Bosphorus because it's such a perilous stretch of water. Over its 20 miles or so, the direction of the water changes around 9 times. And we now know why that is. There's rather brilliant work by the University of Leeds that's discovered that underneath the Bosphorus Straits, created during that extraordinary transport of water around 5,500 BCE, an underwater river was carved out with sediment. So underneath the Bosphorus, there is a submerged river, a submerged marine channel, which runs in the opposite direction. And so that explains that kind of twist and turn of water, and why it is such a difficult water to navigate. But again, it sort of seems to me to almost embody what the city is. So that stretch of water underneath the Bosphorus, if it was on land, would be the 6th biggest river in the world. So it's an incredible geographical phenomenon. But it's, as I said, it's a stretch of water, the combination of the straits, which is perilous, but also promises adventure and excitement. And it feels as though, right from that very early prehistoric moment, this is a city that invites people, that welcomes them to come in, but they have to meet the city on the front foot. And my goodness, they came. This is a city that many people have claimed to found. And when I was writing the book, just in May, just before publication, this rather remarkable tomb was discovered in the western side of the city, dating back 4,000 years, around 2000 BCE. Again, with a man curled up in a fetal position, you can see him just in the middle there. And the Turkish authorities, I have to say, were delighted when this was discovered, because it's in a very typical round shape from Central Asia, sort of the same as the Kurgan tombs of Central Asia. And some of the Turkish, not the archaeologists actually, but some in Turkey's PR department announced that this proved that the Turks had founded Istanbul 4,000 years ago. Obviously not entirely true, but nor, and I say this with great anxiety given where I am in the Hellenic Centre, nor, I have to say, did the Greeks found Byzantium. Much as I would love that to be the case, we know from the archaeology that there was a thriving local native Thracian population there. But the Greeks certainly come sometime around the 7th century BC. Whether it's in peace or in anger, they sail, as we're told by Herodotus, from the Greek mainland, from the little city of Megara, and they make the foundation first on the Asian shore and then at what is Byzantium. This is now set to become a Greek city. Again, I've just put this in to show you some of both the Greek and the Roman monuments that were set up in early Byzantium. It's interesting to me, if you look at that very early archaeology that's coming out, where, for instance, there are a lot of Thracian loanwords that appear in the Byzantine inscriptions. It's clear that this is a city that is Greek in many ways, and as we know, the Greeks invented history and are very, very good at writing themselves into it, and they tell us that this was indeed a purely Greek city. But it's almost as if the Greeks can't quite Doric column out the easternness, the otherness of this city. And we see that in the gods and the goddesses who are worshipped with a real passion there. Goddesses particularly, and as Zetta has said, I'm very interested in the story of the female of the species, whether that be divine or mortal, in the story of the world. And I wasn't expecting to find this, but when you look at Byzantium, goddesses seem to be very, very important to it throughout its history, right through the Christian period as well. And one of the favourite goddesses of the city was this remarkable, feisty creature, Cybele. So this is Cybele, the eastern goddess. The Romans called her the Magna Mater, the big mother, the great fertility nature goddess, who's often shown either with a chariot drawn by lions or with big cats sitting either side of her. And Cybele was a kind of totemic goddess for the city. Some of you will know about her as a goddess. She's quite a character. She was so female that it was said that her priests could not be fully male, and so her priests, the Galli, had to self-castrate themselves in order to be the priests of Cybele. They wore their hair long and had lovely makeup, and they passionately adored this female goddess, as I said, who was a kind of totem of the city. As was also adored this sorceress goddess, Hecate, who you all know. So Hecate, the wonderful goddess who is the goddess of borders and boundaries, of gateways, of liminal spaces. So of course was a very natural goddess to look after Byzantium, which sits between many worlds, east and west, north and south. This is a coin minted for her in the 1st century. So she becomes probably the patron goddess of the city around the 2nd century BCE. And I put this in, again, just to be cheeky, because I have very many Turkish friends, and occasionally they say, oh, we don't know why you're so interested in the kind of early Greek history of the city and the story of the city before the Ottoman period, and it's a Turkish, and they wave their Turkish flags at me. And then I gently show them a coin of Hecate, which has, of course, the crescent moon and the star or the sun in centre. And this is a symbol that was adopted passionately by the inhabitants of Constantinople right away through its history, right up to 1453, and was used by some Byzantine aristocrats as a standard, and was, I don't know if some of you have seen, there's a very beautiful visual reference to St. John Chrysostom in the Peloponnese, and he has this standard with the crescent moon and the star. So it's a very ancient symbol. So this is a city which, as I said, is at the border between worlds, north and south, east and west. It's a city that honours women, whether they be divine or mortal, and it's a city that also has enormous economic promise. And because of that, of course, the Romans, who I love a little less than I love the ancient Greeks, the Romans recognised its economic potential, and they turned Byzantion into the city of Byzantium and based themselves there, particularly in from around the 1st century AD onwards. Again, we know this now from this very unremarkable monument that's right in the centre of modern-day Istanbul. So if you look at that, you've got the Blue Mosque just to the right, the Hagia Sophia just to the left. And this is the Milion. Now this should be kind of one of the world's greatest and most adored world-class monuments, but my goodness, it's neglected and etiolated today, as you can see. If you look at that image, the base of the column, that's the Roman level of the city, and if you peer down now, you'll see it's often got fag packets and sweet papers, and there's usually a cat giving birth to kittens down at the bottom. But that shouldn't be, because this is one of the most significant monuments from the classical world, because this, as I said, was the Milion. This was the mother of all mile markers in the Roman world, probably set up by the Emperor Septimius Severus around 200 AD. And this was the marker that really defined civilization in the Roman world. From the Milion, from that point, all distances in the Roman world were measured. So this was kind of ground zero for civilization, beyond which there lay barbarian land. So that monument that just about clings on the city tells us, in a way, psychologically, how important Byzantium was to the Romans. And it was important, again, as a strategic centre, a centre where people could reach out to the east, but also a centre which could enjoy enormous trading profits from merchant ships coming from 3 continents, sometimes even 4 continents, but also from a city that actually just could make a lot of cash from taxing people up and down the Bosphorus Straits, and from the huge sale of fish that are flooded through the Bosphorus Straits and up into the Golden Horn. You'll probably all know the Golden Horn probably gets its name from the kind of diamond bright sparkle of fish scales that historically could be seen in the city up until the moment when it became dreadfully polluted in the 1950s and 60s. So it was a city that mattered to the Romans militarily, strategically, economically. And again, we can see that now from these remarkable archaeological finds in the city centre. What you're looking at here is a boat from the 4th century AD that's survived in the Theodosian harbour, that's been excavated when, as I said, the metro system and the tunnels underneath the Bosphorus are being dug up. This is one of the incredible things that's discovered, this whole harbour of Theodosius. Any archaeologists in the room will know that is a remarkable state of preservation for a wooden boat from the 4th century AD. There are 37 boats like this that have been preserved in the Bosphorus mud, and not only have the boats been preserved, but their contents. So we have ship's rope, perfect ship's rope, crates of glasses without a chip, a bowl of cherries, the brazier of the ship's captain with his last meal on it, Huge numbers of animal bones, interestingly, so again we kind of get a sense of the animals that were both bred in the city and then butchered to be eaten. Interestingly, ostriches, donkeys and bears looked as though they were being butchered for their meat. Vast numbers of big cats being brought in to fight in the arena, because this of course was the new Rome, so Byzantium saw plenty of games. And then incredibly touchingly, in one of these boats, there's a little dog who was obviously much loved by its owner, and the dog has broken his front leg, and the owner has mended it with a splint. And then tragically, we think there was probably a tsunami, which is why all these boats have ended up at the bottom of the harbour, because there is sand and shells swirled into the boats' bellies. So the poor dog was cared for and then drowned in a tsunami. But anyway, loved, briefly loved. And something which turns up time and time again in these boats are these vast numbers of amphorae of wine. And this, for any of you that know anything about Byzantium, was incredibly exciting for us historians, because we've always been told in the literature that Byzantium was a place that really enjoyed its booze. Quite a kind of heady place. I kind of think of it a little bit like Brighton in the UK. City, kind of what happened in Byzantium stayed in Byzantium, one gets the feeling. And they were said to be great drinkers. Just to read you a couple of little excerpts from literature which tell us about their drinking. This is Menander, of course, the brilliant playwright of the 4th century BC. This is what he writes. Byzantium makes all of her merchants drunkards. The whole night through, for your sake, we were drinking, and frankly, it was darn strong wine too. At any rate, I rose this morning with a head for 4. And then in the 3rd century, rather more poetically and beautiful, Moero, who was a poetess, one of the few female poets that we know of from antiquity, writes much more romantically about the city's love of wine. A cluster of grapes, full of the drops of Dionysus, you rest indeed under the cover of Aphrodite's golden chambers. No longer will your mother vine, throwing the beloved vine twig around you, string forth the divine leaf over your head, but we will drink to you, Dionysus, the great god, the bringer of joy. So, very exciting for us historians, as I said, to have it proved in the archaeology that there was quite a lot of wine was drunk, transported and traded in the late Roman, early medieval city of Byzantium. So it's a city that enjoys itself. It's a city that is a place of pleasure, but also, of course, a city that thought of itself as being blessed. And the religious nature of this city is really fascinating, because actually, if you look at it clinically, nothing particularly extraordinary happened there in religious terms, and yet it manages almost to manufacture a divine significance for itself. Of course, helped by Constantine the Great. The emperor who converts to Christianity, we think, is baptized at the end of his life, crowned emperor here in Britain, in York, and makes Byzantium, Constantinople, his new headquarters, the new headquarters for his great Christian empire, Christian experiment. There are lots of businessists in the room, and I'd love to have a chat with you afterwards, but I don't know if you agree. It seems to me people talk about Constantine the Great in overly cynical terms. Many people say, oh, he probably just converted in order to kind of stay popular with his troops, many of whom were converting to Christianity, that he was kind of keeping his options open. But I get the sense, from what was written about him, and again from the archaeology, that this was an extraordinary moment for this man, and that he really does have decide that this is going to give a better option, a better life for those of his empire, of his subjects who live in his empire, that it's a very heartfelt decision. He left, of course, a lot of Christian monuments in the city, and one of the monuments which kind of brilliantly combines both the pagan and Christian magpie nature of that moment in history is the Column of Constantine, still standing in modern-day Istanbul. Again, dare I say, slightly neglected. It's now become the kind of favoured home for the city's pigeons. If you go there, the pigeon sellers have all moved underneath. But my goodness, what a remarkable monument in its heyday. So it stands at 115 feet now. It was 160 feet when it was first built, topped with a statue. We don't quite know what the statue was, but from descriptions, this is our best bet. A kind of extraordinary naked figure, either Sol Invictus or Constantine as Apollo or Constantine as a kind of naked Christ with this extraordinary solar crown. But what's significant are the relics that we're told that Constantine had melded into this monument. So we hear that in that solar crown were nails from the cross that Jesus was crucified on. If you go down the column, there was buried underneath the very adze, ladies and gentlemen, that Noah used to build the ark. And if that wasn't enough, the panniers that Jesus used to feed the 5,000 were also, I don't quite know where they were fitted, but they were kind of squatting down there. And then again, just to keep the old gods on side, we're told that Constantine also buried under here the Palladium, the extraordinary statue of Pallas Athena, which had been taken, we're told again, from Troy to Rome, and then Constantine had it brought back to the city. So an incredible kind of magpie, as I say, sort of hodgepodge monument that tells us of this remarkable time when the story of the world was changed by Constantine's decision to convert to Christianity. One of the things that happens from this moment on, and again this is part of the city which survives right to the present day, is that because it becomes a Christian city, it very, very quickly, through the known world, gains a reputation as being a city of sanctuary. That this is a city where you become, interestingly, irrespective of your race, creed or religion often, but if you get to the gates, it's a city that will offer you sanctuary. And again, I'd love to hear afterwards from some of the other historians in the room, if you can think of another city that maintains that sense of being a place of sanctuary with quite such vigour, because it survives right the way through the story of the city. And even now, as you all know, given the size of the city, there are more refugees in Istanbul than there are in any other city in the world. So it's something, it's almost as if it's, as I said, it's a sort of part of the kind of substructure of the character of the city. And we know this, as I said, from the historical documents right the way through the medieval period. So in 539, the quaestor of the city is given the responsibility of checking the refugees in and out of the city, documenting them, finding out where they came from, what persecution they were fleeing. It continues through to the late medieval period with the fall of Andalusia, of Al-Andalus. Muslim and Jewish refugees come to the city. Albanians come there throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, and I just had to put this little picture in the build-up to the First World War, at that time when the Balkans were in such crisis and a large number of Muslim families died. The children, Muslim orphans of those families, were given sanctuary in the mosques of the city. So these are some of these children with their blankets hanging up to dry in the mosques of Istanbul. So a city that welcomed people in. Emperors who came there came as refugees. So, as I said, a city which has this sort of sense that if you can get there, then it's a city that will offer you sanctuary. And I promised I would talk about Theodora, because one of the historical characters who really puts her money where her mouth is in terms of offering sanctuary to those who need it is the great Empress Theodora. So here she is in the famous portrait in Ravenna. I have to throw all historical neutrality aside when I speak of Theodora, because my goodness, what a girl she was. Quite a woman. And again, there's very interesting work now that's looking at the kind of sensational stories that are written about her. And we're trying to work out whether that's all made up or whether actually we see in the reforms that her and Justinian worked on, whether actually it's more likely to be true. But again, for those of you who don't know, Theodora starts life right at the bottom of the social pile. So we're told that she's the daughter of a bear tamer and an actress, meaning a prostitute, that she herself was an erotic dancer and used to entertain in the hippodrome in between the chariot races. this is a very polite room, so I won't go into details, but she would reenact a number of the Greek myths. The rape of Leda by Zeus as a swan was one of them. And we're told that Theodora couldn't afford a swan, so she used a goose. I will leave the rest of your imagination. But so you know, a woman, a girl with a fruity past, shall we say. But clearly a woman who was very, very, very smart. So we're told, the biographical detail of her life, that she leaves Constantinople, not to put too fine a point on it, sort of sleeps her way up the ranks of officials, converts to Christianity, is employed as an imperial spy, comes back into Constantinople, where somehow, we can only imagine how, she attracts the attention of the to-be emperor Justinian. And Justinian is so enamoured of her, he changes the law so that an emperor can marry an actress, again, in inverted commas. And the two are catnip to one another. Courtiers describe, you know, with great horror that they kiss one another, that they show affection to one another, but you get the sense that these two, both of whom came from very lowly origins, are determined to make a life for themselves and for their subjects through this great city of Constantinople. So their building programmes are extraordinary, their legal reforms are extraordinary. Between them, they effect remarkable social reform. We're talking about the 6th century AD. So things like sex trafficking and pimping and infanticide, there are efforts to outlaw those. The penalties for rape are increased. One of the laws that I love that's passed at this time, I just wonder if Theodora had something to do with it, is that men have to ask their wives twice before they get into debt. It's a kind of very specific law that feels that there was a bad experience at some point. And again, we're told that Theodora does this remarkable thing of set up a safe house for prostitutes, for fallen women, the House of Repentance, the foundations of which still exist on the eastern shores of the Bosphorus, underneath a military school. So she really is an incredible woman. She is absolutely ahead of her time, and a lot of what we hear about her is very critical, but she seems to me to be truly remarkable. And one of the things that she does is welcome in refugees, and we know this, that they come, again, not to a sort of refugee camp, but actually into the palace quarters themselves. And there's a brilliant account from a carpenter who complains that Theodora has welcomed in so many refugees, so many women and children are coming in to attend the services by the monks and the clergy that she's offering sanctuary to, that the floor collapses in one of her rooms, and there's this sort of grumpy, I told her, you know, that can't have that many refugees in one space without there being trouble. But as I said, she's a really incredible woman, and sort of sets the tone for the city, which, as we all know, in its history has times of remarkable intolerance, but at its very best is a city that is tolerant. And what her and Justinian also do is they maintain this notion that this is a city that matters at all points of the compass. So in the 6th century AD, this is a city that has communications, trade and diplomatic communications, and contacts with Iceland, with India, with China, with southern Africa, and even, ladies and gentlemen, with dear old, blustery, windy, mizzling Britannia. What you're looking at here, I don't know, does anybody recognise this? Let me see. So this is a Tintadle. So this is the Tintadle headband in northern Cornwall. This is how it looked in the 6th century, at the time of Justinian and Theodora's reign. This has been generated by what was then English heritage. And Tintadle tells us something incredible about the relationship with the very, very, very edges of the known world and the city of Constantinople. There was a great deal of trade directly between Constantinople and Tintadle. And we know this because in 1983 there was a scrub fire on the headland there, which cleared a large area and exposed, I don't think you can, slightly faint, I don't think you can see, there are workhouses and workshops and storerooms that were exposed on that headland. And so far only 10% of that headland has been excavated, but in that 10% of the headland of Tintadle, there is more Byzantine pottery fragments than there are anywhere else in Western Europe. So again, if you just think about the maths of that, that is a remarkable degree of trade, crossing over a 6,000-mile round trip. And you ask why. And the obvious answer is tin, because Cornwall has tin, and we obviously need tin to make bronze, and so it's worth sending those sailors around. But the truth is, there is tin which is far more accessible and closer to Constantinople. You do not need to send traders and merchants off on a 6,000-mile trip across very perilous oceans. So what we think is happening in the maintenance of that trade contact is a way that Constantinople can keep in touch with, diplomatically and in mercantile terms, with those right at the edges. And Justinian, we're told, rather brilliantly, patronisingly, my goodness, how times have changed now, offers out what he calls subsidies to the barbarians of Britannia. So there's this kind of notion that he needs to keep, and wants to keep us on board, that we are part of what was the new Roman Empire, what is now the new Roman Empire, that was the old Roman Empire. And again, we see it, the connections time and time again in the archaeology. This is the very beautiful Desborough necklace, worn by Anglo-Saxon aristocrats, modelled exactly on the necklaces worn by women like Theodora back in Constantinople. And I just put these in because they just very freshly come up out of the ground. These lovely coins minted in Constantinople, in Byzantium, which have turned up just 6 kilometres away from Sutton Hoo in East Anglia. Again, I'm sure you all know about the Sutton Hoo extraordinary ship burial, where a king was buried with treasures from Constantinople, beautiful silver plates and silver spoons and little ivory plaques. But that was a burial site, and Rendlesham, which is the only very recently identified city of the living, probably where those kings and courtiers lived, is yielding vast amounts of Byzantine coinage. And the coinage is scattered everywhere, so these aren't hoards of coins, these aren't sort of exotic trophies that have been buried. The range and the distribution of the coins suggests both that Byzantine coinage was being used as a kind of common currency in Europe at the time, but also that there were real Byzantine aristocrats who were really making that journey to places like Rendlesham, again in order to stitch together this world. So from the very furthest reaches of the west to what was then the centre of the east. So a city that is hyper-connected. But of course a city that has all this going for it, that's hyper-connected, that's beautiful, that has made a name for itself across the continents. This is the city as it would have been in the 9th century AD. A beautiful city like this is a jewel that will attract thieves, inevitably. Famously, it's attacked 12 times by Arab and Islamic forces before the fall of Constantinople in 1453. It's also attacked a huge number of times by the Vikings, by the Rus, who have a kind of love-hate relationship with the city. They kind of adore it, and they want it, and you almost get the sense they don't quite want to take it over because they wouldn't know what to do with it once they had it, but they're just tempted, and they come to the city and they're fought off by Greek fire attacks in the Bosphorus Straits and on the Sea of Marmara. And then the relationship starts to change, and a number of Vikings and of the Rus convert to Christianity, and there becomes this sort of edgy, charged friendship between the two societies. And there's a rather brilliant document, again, that tells us about this, that in the 10th century AD, a law is passed, and this really reminds me, I don't know if you can remember, ladies and gentlemen, they've sort of stopped doing it now. Do you remember on newsagents, there often used to be little letters posted up by the owners saying that school children could come in, but only if they came in 2 at a time and they behaved? Well, something very similar happened with the Vikings in the 10th century AD. So a law is passed, the Vikings can come into the city of Constantinople, but only if they come 50 at a time, through one particular gate, and if they promise not to rape or pillage, they will be given free bed and breakfast for the evening. So it's a kind of really interesting development in the relationship. And the Vikings, as I said, keep on coming. You all know about the famous runes carved in the upper balustrade of Hagia Sophia. Just recently, somebody has identified rather brilliantly on a couple of the marble columns up there as well. Obviously, a Viking attendant at one of the services has stood and with his brooch behind his back has carved in Viking longboats, rather bad bit of vandalism. There are 6 of these. You can go up in my book. It shows you where they are. You can go and have a look at them. But so that they were definitely there. And the Vikings also loved this city because they had a slight sort of fetish for silk. The Vikings. I think we don't imagine that when we think of them. Michael and I have talked about this on Vikings Live at the British Museum. They loved their silk, the Vikings. We think that they made some of their boat sails out of silk. They loved silk scarves, couldn't get enough of silk scarves from Constantinople. And again, rather kind of wonderfully, they think they're getting the top quality goods, and the traders in the city itself are basically saying that we're just giving them the kind of factory cast-offs, but they're only Vikings, they won't really know. So the Vikings are in the city, attacking it sometimes being the allies of those. And again, of course, in the Byzantine court, we then find that the Byzantine emperors are guarded by a personal guard, the Varangian Guard, made up in part of Vikings, of the Rus, and indeed of Anglo-Saxon nobles from England, who come here escaping the Norman boot of William the Conqueror. So the Vikings were there too in the city, and again, recent work has told us that some of these Vikings end up being pensioned off and forming a sort of expat colonies around the Black Sea. So around the Black Sea we have little settlements of Suasto, those who came from what is now Sussex, and there's even Londinia, a little London on the shores of the Black Sea where the Varangian Guard went. So it's a city, as I said, it's a cosmopolitan city. It's a city that has people of many backgrounds and ethnicities there, but a city that is beginning to attract too much attention for its own good. And in 1204, in a story of the world that has its grubby and degraded moments, it has to be one of the most appalling when the Christian crusaders from the west, from the Latins and the Franks, come to the Holy Land and decide that rather than attacking Islamic-held cities, they are going to attack Constantinople because it contains what they basically describe as the wrong kind of Christian. And it's, when you read the accounts, it's heartbreaking to hear about that moment. Again, as you all know, many of the Latins and Franks were illiterate, so they didn't write accounts, but most of those within Constantinople were literate. So we have eyewitness accounts of what happened. And these sort of terrible, heartrending. There's one particular line where people are standing on the walls of Constantinople and they look out and say, look at these men, they have crosses on them, they must be our allies, and then they suddenly see the arrows and the gunshot being unleashed on the city of Constantinople. And just, we're told by an eyewitness from the dreadful event of the Fourth Crusade, 1204, tearing children from mothers and mothers from children, treating the Virgin with wanton shame in holy chapels, viewing with fear neither the wrath of God nor the vengeance of men, the Crusaders, in the name of God, destroyed what they found in their path. And this is, I suspect that this is a moment where this beautiful city, this millennia-old city, loses a sense of itself. It's such an appalling crime that it's almost as though the city loses its mojo. And although there is a cultural fluorescence again in the 14th century, it is never quite the same city. And in 1453, having eaten up the territories around, the Ottomans then finally famously take Constantinople, the fall of Constantinople in May of 1453. I'm aware that I've been talking for a long time, so I'm going to very, very, very briefly rattle through the Ottoman history of the city in 5 minutes or so. One of the things I think that we should remember about the Ottoman period in the city is that this wasn't, although it's often portrayed in textbooks as an extraordinary clash of civilizations, there was a lot more liaison between the Byzantines and the Ottomans. And there's a beautiful document in the British Library, which you can go and look at and has also been put online, which was written just 2 days after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. It's a very fair document. There are just 2 corrections to it. And it's a document that allows the freedom of trade and worship for the Italians in the city. And just the fact that it's such a fair copy, this shows us that these were arrangements, negotiations that have been dealt with in minute detail in the weeks and days leading up to the fall. So, as I said, I think we can't think of this as a moment that came out of the blue. This was a moment where there was a lot of negotiation, almost administration change. And certainly what happened is when the Ottomans take over the city, although there is terrible bloodshed and loss and destruction of much culture, pretty quickly the sultans realised that in order to survive as a city, they need to welcome back in those who were important in the city before and the cultural influence from outside. And I just wanted to show you one example of this. So one of the sultans decides that he wants to establish a bridge building competition in the city. Us Londoners know that bridge building is a slightly vexed endeavour, but the Sultan says that he wants a new bridge over the Golden Horn. The word goes out that all the greatest artists and architects in Europe should apply for this bridge building competition. One of the artists who applies to be the architect is no less than Leonardo da Vinci. And what you're looking at here, ladies and gentlemen, is Leonardo da Vinci's notebook. And this is actually in Paris, and this is his sketch for the bridge that he wants to build over the Golden Horn. And wonderfully, we have his letter translated into Ottoman Turkish in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum archives, and so we know exactly what Leonardo wrote to the Sultan. Leonardo, what an extraordinary man. A man not without ego, I would say. And just listen to the letter he writes to the Sultan of Istanbul. I, your servant, Leonardo, I have heard that you intended to construct a bridge from Istanbul to Galata, but you could not, because no sufficient expert could be found. I, your servant, know how to make it. I could raise an arch so high that nobody would want to pass over it because of its height. I could construct it in such a way that even a sailing ship could pass underneath it, and you can see in the sketchbook there, a little sailing ship passing under his bridge. I am the man to build this bridge for you. I, Leonardo da Vinci, will build the new bridge for Istanbul. This is what he writes. Rather pleasingly in a way, it's a letter that goes completely unanswered. So you can imagine the Sultan going, Leonardo, who? You know, we don't need him. And it just joins in a pile of letters written by want-to-be architects, and the bridge never actually gets built. But it kind of shows us that it was a city that was reaching out to those beyond. And again, you'll all know about the extraordinary architect and artist, Sinan. What you're looking at here is Soleimani Mosque. Sinan, who was either Greek or Armenian, we don't know, but who constructed incredible monuments in the city, 120 of which are still standing. Again, rather beautifully, in the 1930s, after the establishment of the Republic, the Turks were very, very keen to prove that Sinan was Turkish, and so they disinterred him and measured his skull to prove that he had the racial characteristics of a Turk, and he didn't. So rather embarrassedly, the skull was reburied, and as I said, we now that know that he's either Greek or Armenian, but an incredible man, and a man who brought such beauty to the city, light captivating, soul captivating, his designs were described as. And I just put this in just to show you that in the Soleimani Mosque, in that incredible dome, again, recent work has showed us that embedded in the top of that dome, there are 255 inverted terracotta pots in order to generate a unique acoustic in the central space. And travellers and visitors to the mosque often described going in and it being as though there was a wall of sound when prayers were recited in the mosque, that you could almost cut your way through the sound in that central space. And we now know it's because Sinan invented what was basically a Helmholtz resonator, centuries before the Helmholtz resonator was invented. And again, the sublimes are ridiculous, just to show you another of his lovely pieces of work. This is the Kilik Ali Pasha Hammam, built next to the Kilik Ali Pasha Mosque, built for a returning hero from the Battle of Lepanto. And that's recently been renovated. And they stripped away 400 layers of historical accretion and discovered that it looks as though Sina had invented a new kind of plaster to case the inside of this building, to maintain the health of both the bathers and of the building, so that the heat and steam kept inside, but the building could breathe. So kind of incredible, inventions. And so a city that still kept up this notion that it was at its best when it welcomed in those from outside with new ideas. And I promised that I would just touch on the power of the women in the city. We've mentioned Theodora, we've talked about those goddesses, Cybele and Hecate, and I just want to finish with a very brief visit to the harem. What you're looking at here is a very early 18th century, rather lovely watercolour of the harem. There's the black eunuch on the left-hand side who's in charge of the harem. And this was a place where, we say the word harem, and it unfortunately conjures up Pavlovian images of lots of women with sort of naked flesh bathing one another or oiling one another. I can guarantee you, not a lot of that went on in the harem. The harem was basically the royal household, as any other European royal household was, and was both a terrible place to be, I think, as a woman, and, if you were lucky, a place of opportunity. This was a place where, at its very worst, you were the slave of slaves. We know that tuberculosis was rife in the harem. Vast numbers of women died of tuberculosis. Huge numbers of the sultans also had tuberculosis. But if you were clever and lucky, you had a chance to make your mark from within the harem. And I'm just going to finish with one woman who did exactly that. She was a concubine called Safiye. Her name means the pleasing one, so we suspect she was probably very beautiful. And Safiye was taken as a 13-year-old from a little Albanian village and ends up in Istanbul. She marries this, is chosen as the kind of premier wife by the Sultan, gives birth to his first son, and this means that she is in a position of incredible power. In the Ottoman world, you cannot be more powerful than as the valide, the mother of the Sultan. And my goodness, she uses that power that she has. We know this partly because of the letters of English diplomats in particular, were terribly anxious about the power of Safiye. They described this as being a sultanate of women, where women had the ear of the Sultan and seemed to make the decisions themselves. And one of the diplomats in the city, John Sanderson, writes with horror that he'd seen Safiye espying a number of boats upon the river hurrying together. She, Safiye, hearing that it was the vizier, bustling out to do justice upon certain chavvies, that is, whores. So, interestingly, again, it seems that Safiye is trying to protect the prostitutes in the city, a kind of incredible thing to do. She, Safiye, taking displeasure, sent word and advised the eunuch Vizier Bassa that her son, the Sultan, being absent on campaign, had left him to govern the city and not to devour its women. So this was the report from John Sanderson. It gives us just a sort of sense of the feistiness of Safiye. But then, rather splendidly, we have much more detail about the opinions and self-confidence of Safiye from a series of letters that she writes to Elizabeth I of England. So this is really interesting. So Elizabeth I and Safiye, a concubine in the harem, strike up a correspondence. And what they basically say, and forgive me, gentlemen in the room, I do love gentlemen, but there is a moment when female common sense kicks in. And they basically say, look, these chaps seem to be messing up the international affairs. Shall we just agree that we're going to sort it out between us? And so they write letters about trade deals and whether pirates whether the hostages should be ransomed so that they can escape the pirates, and the release of certain English sailors, and whether there are going to be diplomatic visits between the city. And as I said, they are quietly managing international affairs by themselves. So just listen to this. This is a letter written by Safiye to Elizabeth I in 1593. I can repeatedly mention your Highness's gentility and praise at the foot dust of His Majesty, so the Sultan, the sovereign who has Alexander's place. Very interesting, I think, that Safiye is comparing the Sultan to Alexander the Great. This is in 1593. I shall endeavour for your Elizabeth's aims. So she's basically saying, don't worry about it, what you want to happen, we'll sort that out. Your letter has arrived and reached us. God willing, action will be taken according to what you said. May we always be firm in friendship. God willing, may our friendship never die. Your will be done. So there we are, Elizabeth having her will done by Safiye. The two of them become great friends. They exchange gifts. There becomes sort of slightly competitive gift giving between them. So one sends embroidered towels, and the other sends a pearl tiara, and then the first sends a golden carriage. So you just feel they're slightly showing off. But then at the end of this particular letter, when I said they sort of sorted out international affairs, dare I say, being women, they start to exchange makeup tips. So it says, Safiye writes, on account of your Majesty's being a woman, I hear there are to be found in your kingdom rare distilled waters of every kind for the face, and odoriferous oils for the hands. Or your Majesty would favour me by sending some of them to me by my hand for this, the most serene queen. And then she's obviously realised that she's in the harem, so it's very likely that the other members of the harem are going to get their hands on these face lotions. So she said, for my hand only, for this, the serene Queen Safiye, because being in the harem, she does not wish them to pass through other hands. So it's a tiny moment, but that little PS, in a way, seems to me to sum up the brilliance and the brio and the humanity of this incredible city. It's a city that at its very best is tolerance, that allows social mobility, that allows women as well as men to have a play and to be players in the world. It's a city that's been described as a virgin who's enjoyed many husbands. Napoleon said if the world were one country, then Istanbul would be its capital. It's the city described as the new Rome, the new Zion, the threshold, Allah's city, the queen of cities, the greatest city on earth. And I think why it can hold its head up when it's described in those remarkable ways is because this is a city that is constitutionally cosmopolitan. If civilization survives by welcoming in those across borders and boundaries, cities can only thrive if it reaches out to those beyond its city walls. And that, at its very best, is what the city of Constantinople has done. So why I love this city? I love it for many reasons. But I love it because I think at its very best, when it's behaving well and when its rulers are behaving well, it's a city that teaches us what it is to be truly cosmopolitan, and it's a city that teaches us what it is to be effective citizens of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Bettany, for a really fascinating lecture, very touching as well, because I know that there are a lot of people in this hall who have the roots in Constantinople, and it's really very touching. One of these, my grandma was as well. Fine. Now I would like to call upon Professor Paul Cartledge to give us the vote of thanks. Thank you.
This is Matty Egon. I would like to echo what Bettany said about Nicholas. Madame Kalispera, Madame Edme Leventis, a dear friend and patron indeed of me. Dr Zetta And I notice your name, Theodoropoulou, not unlike Theodora, Polychroniadis. Ex-Ambassador Kipma, former student of mine. I taught him all he knows. Other former students, friends, Axiotomy, Kyriaska, Kyrian, fellow barbarians. It is a huge honour and pleasure and privilege for me to have been asked by Zetta to deliver this vote of thanks. And because I am an honorary citizen of Sparta, I am going to be laconic. I'm sure you're all waiting to move on to one of the items, one of the many items in the cornucopia that Bettany brought before us in her talk. What's in a name? Shakespeare asked. Byzantium, Constantinople, Istanbul, Stamboul. And I was very disappointed that Mikkelgarth didn't get a mention. That's the Viking name. And so I was just a little bit disappointed we were given a tale of only 3 cities. No. It was utterly brilliant. Just a week ago, I was in Athens, another wondrous capital city, with a certain Bettany, who, apart from all her other talents, is now a Vachologos. That's to say, she's a student of Bacchus. I don't mean that she's a wino or a dipsomaniac, but that she is compiling yet another documentary to add to her 50+. Some of us were privileged both to take part in and to watch her last one on Aphrodite, for which we received astonishing support from the Leventis Foundation. And her next one is going to be on Bacchus, and many people think Bacchus is a Roman name. It is a Roman name, but actually they just borrowed it as they borrowed so much else, and probably debased the original Greek Bacchus. So Istanbul, Constantinople, Byzantium, named after Byzas. We have to put back the odd male. I'm going to fight for the odd male. It was actually named after a male. Whether he existed or not is another question, of course. But anyway, it means quite a lot to me too. And I'm not going to visit or revisit current griefs. I have a particular issue with a certain sultan of around about 1800, of our era. But I'm going to move back a long way further to a couple of things which Bettany astonishingly didn't manage to fit in. She managed to fit in, I don't know how much. One of them is a little word, demokratia. Some of you may have heard a lecture I gave here not so long ago about demokratia. Well, that word was used in the Chronicle of John Malalas, who was a contemporary of Justinian, talking about the Nika victory riots in 540-541 in the Hippodromos, the hippodrome or horse race course, which you saw an image of in one of the last slides. There was a riot, a sort of Heysel Stadium, appalling disaster, and people were killed, blues and greens had it in for each other. And Malalas, writing up his account in a little bit of recollected tranquility, had the nerve, the gall, to describe what happened in the hippodrome as demokratia. In other words, by the 6th century of our era, this wondrous word, coined by the Athenians in the 5th century BCE, had so been degenerated that it was now an equivalent of riot. And the other thing that I mentioned also, coincidentally, in connection with that particular artifact, the hippodrome, Constantinople is an interesting congeries of objects gathered together from many places. Bettany rather politely perhaps called him a magpie. There are other words that one could use, but he wanted to make his new Rome also a new Athens, and so he got hold of a stele, very massive one, in bronze, topped by 3 snakes' heads, inscribed with 32 names, beginning with Lacedaemonioi, my fellow citizens, and it is the war memorial of one of the most important battles in the entirety, not just of ancient Greek, Hellenic, but of human history, namely the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE. So that was removed from Delphi, the most sacred site in Old Greece, to New Rome, and of course the Byzantines rather sadly called themselves Romans. They didn't call themselves Hellenes, but we all make mistakes. But that one went on for about 1,000 years, so it was rather a big mistake. Anyway, if you go to the Hippodrome, you can actually see the remains of that, we call it the Serpent Column. So it has points of significance for me too. The book. Those of you who know Callimachos, the scholar of the 3rd century BCE, mega polymath, and one who devised a kind of catalogue for the library, the Royal Library of Alexandria, he uttered an immortal phrase which many librarians after him have felt deeply in sympathy with. And it went something like this: a big book, and this is an exceptionally big book, adds up to a very great evil. It's a very bad thing, but there are always exceptions, and this obviously is one of them. And it contains many, many wondrous things. It received a multitude of reviews from very, very distinguished reviewers, and almost without exception they were unanimous in their praise of this terrific book, which, as Bettany said, took 10 years on and off, and it really is what Herodotus would have called an ergon. It's an achievement, a work. Well, I'm just going to quote you a snatch from just one of the many reviews that this book has received, and it's from a review by Elif Shafak, who will be known to some of you. This is not only for lovers of history, or for those who have visited one of the most important cities on earth. Anyone who cares about culture, civilization, multiculturalism, and collective memory will find this book of interest. And that, I would say, is a little bit of a euphemism, lightities. It's of massive interest and terrific importance. And I'm just going to end by saying, my dear friend Bettany, we've collaborated in many, many projects, and I am exceptionally privileged to have her as a friend as well as a collaborator. She is the most wonderful human being as well as scholar and communicator. So I'm just going to say that not only is she a Philhellene, she is also a Hellenophile. And I would like you please all to applaud. We've been entertained, we have been instructed, and we are going to go away from here better people than where we are.